Good morning, boys and girls. If you don't recognize this flickering candle or this voice, you should. This is your friendly neighborhood, Mr. Farnworth. I am contacting from New York City. Not really. It's actually Tuesday night, and I'm in my apartment recording this, but for all intents and purposes, I am in New York City, and you are, of course, in my classroom. But I wanted to try to retain as much normalcy as possible on a day to day basis. So I figured I would create these videos that are just going to follow along with our class just as if this is a normal day. But it is, of course, up to you to be the responsible one and be sure that you're watching the whole video, following along with my activities, and just overall doing the right thing. I am really inspired by John Green's educational content, his crash course history and crash course literature. I know we've watched some of those in my class. And I just feel like being able to create content like this that's easily accessible is important and can really come in handy, especially in a time like when I'm going to be away for a few days. So, hence, this is what I'm calling our flipped classroom model. And that's the first thing that I want to talk about on this Wednesday. So, what is a flipped classroom model? Well, on today and on Friday, everybody's going to need to make sure that they grab a laptop, headphones, but you should not be using your headphones to listen to music. You should be sure that you're following along with my video, listening to my voice, watching my PowerPoints, and pretty much working as I work. This means you need to make sure you have your book in front of you. This means you need to be sure you have your character chart out. But you should, of course, be following along with me as I go. This flipped classroom model gives me a number of different things that I can do. I can, of course, show you PowerPoints. I can show you some videos. I can assign some writing assignments. I can flip back and forth from Google Drive and show you exactly what I want you to do. Now, this comes in handy for me because I know that I'm giving clear instructions despite the fact that I'm not going to be there for a couple days. However, a lot of the responsibility for this is going to be put on your shoulders because you need to be sure that you're watching this entire video and watching it at a pace that's going to give you enough time to get the work done at the end. You're going to have writing assignments that you need to work on at the end of today's class and at the end of Friday's class, and whatever you don't finish is for homework. You can, of course, pause these videos whenever you need to. I realize that some people need to go to the bathroom, you need to go to the locker to get a book, you need to go get a drink, or whatever you have to do. But be sure that you're maximizing your time, giving yourself enough time to get all of this work done. And that, of course, means that, guys, you got to stay away from the computer games. You already know how I feel about this, and your substitute has been prepped about it. So please be sure that you are not even thinking about playing video games instead of following along with these videos. You know exactly where you'll be headed if you are caught, and you should definitely not tempt it. If I hear about anybody trying to play computer games instead of following along with these videos, there will most definitely be consequences when I come back on Monday. So keep that in mind. If you don't have your book out, you should pull your book. If you don't have your character chart out, you should pull that out as well. What I want to do today is I want to jump off our conversation on Chapter 6, thinking about, of course, Mrs. Rogers' death, but I want to take a look at all of the other characters and what we can learn about them in losing Mrs. Rogers. Of course, at the beginning of Chapter 6, we're reminded of our 10 Little Soldiers poem that says, 9 little soldier boys up very late, one overslept himself, and then they were 8. Of course, Mrs. Rogers is our character that oversleeps herself because she never wakes up in the morning. What's interesting to me and what I'm paying most attention to here is this whole idea of oversleeping to death. Like, Mrs. Rogers is our second victim, but I don't think oversleeping is exactly how she died. And I'm not the only one, because even though we had some characters yesterday that were pretty dumb in what they concluded, we have a couple characters today that have some pretty good ideas. But before that, I just want to show you a quick Calvin and Hobbes comic that I like about oversleeping, where Calvin says, "Oh no, I overslept, I gotta get up," and Hobbes says, "But it's Saturday," and Calvin says, "Well, sure, if it was a school day, what would I care?" That one always makes me laugh. But Mrs. Rogers, unfortunately, did not in fact wake up because she overslept herself to death. Now, she's dead, but what I'm curious about is how. And even though everybody simply concluded yesterday that Anthony Marston dies from suicide, once Mrs. Rogers dies, some of our characters start to figure this thing out. What I really like about this chapter is this is one of the first time that we see characters like Mr. Bloor, like Dr. Armstrong, like Philip Lombard really start to put their heads together and say, okay, what is going on here? And a couple of our characters have theories about how Mrs. Rogers died. What I want you to do is I want you to take your book out and I want you to be sure that you're following along with these couple passages that I'm seeing, because I think these passages paint our characters in a new light depending on exactly how they think that Mrs. Rogers dies. The first character that has a theory about Mrs. Rogers is, of course, Dr. Armstrong, who wakes up from a really creepy, weird dream in which he's operating on some of our other guests in the house and thinking about killing them. But he's woken up by Rogers, who shakes him and, of course, says, Doctor, my wife hasn't woken up. Can you open to page 94, please? And, of course, Google Drive still is a problem even when we're recording. Open to page 94, please. I'm going to start this from where it says, Armstrong said, did she sleep well? And it says, Armstrong said, did she sleep well? Now, Rogers' eyes evaded his. The man's hands came together and turned and twisted uneasily. He muttered, she didn't sleep extra well, no. The doctor said sharply, did she take things to make her sleep? Rogers stared at him, surprised. Take things to make her sleep? Not that I knew of. I'm sure she didn't. Armstrong went over to the washstand. There were a number of bottles on it, hair lotion, lavender water, cascara, glycerine of cucumber for the hands, a mouthwash, toothpaste, and some elements. Rogers helped by pulling out the drawers of the dressing table. From there they moved on to the chest and drawers, but there was no sign of sleeping draughts or tablets. Rogers said, she didn't have nothing last night, sir, except what you gave her. I think Dr. Armstrong's theory here for Mrs. Rogers is that it's something medical. And I think he's pretty much spot on when he's going around and looking to see if there's any weird pills or anything around. But what's interesting to me here is the fact that I think Dr. Armstrong is just trying to do the right thing, but it kind of makes him look suspicious after the dream he was having, especially when Rogers has that last line where he says, hey, I don't think she took anything except what you gave her, Dr. Armstrong. So that kind of pointed the finger directly at him being responsible. But then again, we're not really sure if we can trust Rogers either. Second character that's got a theory as to why Mrs. Rogers is dead is Emily Brent. If you go to page 98, Emily Brent is going to chime in on this conversation, and she's going to start to talk about all of the wickedness and the punishments for the sinners in this similar lingo that we've been getting out of her so far in this novel. Now, Dr. Armstrong is talking about what the potential causes of death could be, and he says dryly, her heart certainly failed to beat, but what caused it to fail is the question. One word fell from Emily Brent. It fell hard and clear into the listening group. Conscience, she said. Armstrong turned to her. What exactly do you mean by that, Miss Brent? Emily Brent, her lips tight and hard, said, you all heard. She was accused, together with her husband, of having deliberately murdered her former employer, an old lady. And you think? Emily Brent said, I think the accusation was true. You all saw her last night. She broke down completely and fainted. The shock of having her wickedness brought home to her was too much for her. She literally died of fear. Dr. Armstrong shook his head doubtfully. It's a possible theory, he said. One cannot adopt it without more exact knowledge of her state of health. If there were some cardiac weakness, Emily Brent said quietly, call it, if you prefer, an act of God. And I find it interesting here that Emily Brent is going around where people are starting to die in this house and preaching about how it's an act of God is why she's dying. Mrs. Rogers simply felt really guilty for what she did, and she was struck dead by God for her wickedness, as far as Emily Brent is concerned. Now, does this make Emily Brent look more suspicious in your eyes or less suspicious? I'm not exactly sure. I guess that's up to you, but all I know is we are learning a lot more about Emily Brent because she's been very quiet to this point in the novel, and now she's coming out with all her theories as to why these characters are dying. I find that interesting. Our last character that's got a theory about Mrs. Rogers is Mr. Bloor, and I think he's an important character to pay attention to because, of course, one, he's a liar, and we know he's a liar, but he's also our detective character, so if there's anybody whose theories are worth listening to, it's Mr. Bloor. In this section, Mr. Bloor, Lombard, and Dr. Armstrong all start to put their heads together to start to think about what's going on this island, and Mr. Bloor kind of asserts himself as a guy that's trying to do the right thing too, I think, or at least trying to solve this mystery any way he can. I'm going to start this on page 100, where it says, "He resumed," down at the bottom of the page, and this is Mr. Bloor talking about what he thinks might have happened to Mrs. Rogers. It says, "He resumed, that's as may be. Anyway, there's no active danger to them as far as they know. Then last night, some unknown lunatic spills the beans. What happens? The woman cracks. She goes to pieces. Notice how her husband hung over her as she was coming round. Not all husbandly solicitude. Not on your life. He was like a cat on hot bricks, scared out of his life as to what she might say. And there's the position for you. They've done a murder and got away with it. But if the whole thing's got to be raked up, what's going to happen? 10 to 1, the woman will give the show away. She hasn't got the nerve to stand up and brazen it out. She's a living danger to her husband. That's what she is. He's all right. He'll lie with a straight face till kingdom comes, but he can't be sure for her. And if she goes to pieces, his neck's in danger. So he slips something into a cup of tea and makes sure that her mouth is shut permanently." Now, Mr. Bloor is pretty much asserting here that he thinks that that Rogers and Mrs. Rogers committed this murder, and Mr. Rogers was worried that Mrs. Rogers would say something about it, would rat them out, and they would get themselves in trouble. And basically, Mr. Bloor is assuming here that Rogers is just sort of covering his tracks after the accusations that came out the day before. Now, all of our other characters, or at least our characters that are in this conversation, are saying, well, it doesn't sound exactly right, a character killing his wife. Why would he do that? But Mr. Bloor seems pretty adamant here. And I think with these three theories, what it does is it points the finger at three other characters as our killer. It points the finger. Dr. Armstrong points the finger right at himself, judging by all of the medicine. Emily Brent points the finger at herself with all of her punishment and wickedness. And Mr. Bloor points the finger at Rogers. And I find it interesting what Agatha Christie is doing with all of our characters here, because this is what we have to consider. This is our group of 10 that we're looking at the slide right now. We have Anthony Marston in the middle here. He's already dead. And now, of course, Mrs. Rogers is dead. Yesterday in class, we talked about how we got insight to the heads of three other characters. That was Vera Claythorne, that was Justice Wargrave, and that was General MacArthur. We hear about them through their flashbacks. In a sense, learn more about who they are as people. I think all three of those characters were painted sort of negatively, and that made them seem very suspicious as well. Now, in this character, you have Rogers. He wakes up Dr. Armstrong from this really creepy dream where he's thinking about killing other characters on the operating table. We have his theory about Mrs. Rogers dying. We have Emily Brent's theory about Mrs. Rogers dying. And we have Mr. Bloor's theory about Mrs. Rogers dying. Now, if you notice, all of our characters have really been accounted for in the last couple chapters. We have Vera, we have Justice, and we have General MacArthur, who we learn about through their backstories. And then we have Rogers, Dr. Armstrong, Emily Brent, and Mr. Bloor, who are put more on display as they try to figure out what exactly might have happened to Mrs. Armstrong. What's interesting to me is we have one character here that sort of hasn't had the spotlight in a little while, and that's our guy Philip Lombard. I'm curious about him because when we started this book, a lot of us were convinced that he was suspicious, that he was a creepy guy, that he says anti-Semitic things, and he's just overall not a really good person. Later on, we find out that he killed 21 men and doesn't even really feel bad about it at all. But other than that, we've been kind of going away from Philip as of late. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's just something that I want you to think about. Who is Philip? Is Philip a good guy? Is Philip a bad guy? Is Philip in on these murders, or is Philip just part of the whole act? I think where Philip really shines is in the film version of And Then They Were None. Now, what I want to do now is I want to watch a clip that kind of backtracks a little bit from where we are right now, but I think is beneficial when we look at who some of our characters are. Now, back when you remember when our gramophone went off that accused all of our characters of murder, some of our characters, like Philip, came right out and admitted what they did. Yes, I killed 21 men. I do not feel bad about it one bit. Meanwhile, we have other characters like Dr. Armstrong who say that they deny having done anything wrong, despite the fact that we know internally they are guilty and they feel very bad about it. Now, what I want to do right now is I'm going to play the television version of our characters talking to each other about what they are accused of. What I want you to pay attention to is our characters' body language, because what's so good about watching film versions of books is that our actors are responsible for either looking suspicious, looking guilty, looking nervous, or looking calm, cool, and collected like some of our characters are in this book. So I'm going to play this. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. I just want you to watch, look for body language, and start to think about how some of our characters' pasts are coming into play.
Just doesn't make any sense. I've never even met him. John Lucy Coombs. Malicious nonsense.
Louise Cleese was a surgical patient. It was risky. There were complications. Everyone knew that. But the moment anything goes wrong, it's blame the bloody surgeon.
No one's blaming you, Doctor.
Well, someone is.
Henry Richmond was one of our finest young officers who fell in pursuit of his gallant duty for king and country. It is repugnant that these vile rumors should be given credence. Repugnant.
Edward Seaton was guilty.
I was party to evidence that was not admissible before the court, but he was guilty.
The only time I laid hands on Landor was to put handcuffs on him. He was a degenerate and a drunk. He choked on his own puke.
Sarah, the little boy, I was his governess. He wasn't supposed to swim. He wasn't strong. But he sneaked off. And I wasn't a good enough swimmer. I just wasn't good enough. I really tried to save him. His poor mother was broken. She was so broken. I had to be rescued. I almost drowned. I could say something like this.
Some sort of vicious joke. Well, if that's your sense of humour, there's something wrong with your wiring. Time for the funny farm.
It was pinpoint accurate about me.
21 men.
I always thought someone would blood. It's amazing how people get an attack of conscience when they're safely tucked away in their beds.
Terrible man. It's people like you, men like you, that put our missionaries in such danger.
Oh, your missionaries with their guards and their syphilis. I am not the only white killer in Africa, Miss Brand.
Lombard, you, sir, are a bloody butcher.
And I'm holding my hands up to it. So either I'm embellishing a story for shocking effect,
Or I'm the only one telling the truth in a room full of lies.
how dare you? Enough. Please, ladies and gentlemen, enough. What good can it do? My feeling is that we should retire and be ready to leave tomorrow with Mr. Narracott.
What if the Owens are with him?
We confront them, but we leave. And despite Mr. Lombard's devastating confession, We are all victims of a cruel hoax. We shouldn't dignify these accusations with any more debate. Agreed?
What I find interesting about this film version here and how some of our characters are portrayed is I love how all of the liars go first, right? Everybody that we know is lying, like Dr. Armstrong, like General MacArthur, like even Justice Wargrave. They come right out and they say, "This is preposterous. This is a horrible thing to say about me. This is not true." But Philip is the one that kind of comes in and says, "No, I'm going to be honest here. I killed 21 men." Now, he seems heartless. He seems vicious. He seems murderous. He seems like he lacks empathy, like he does not care. But interestingly enough, that our one character that is so vicious and vile is our one character that's telling the truth. Does that hold him to a higher standard than some of our other characters? I'm not sure, but Philip is a guy that's still really interesting to me. I'm not sure what to do with Philip just yet. Does that make him our murderer? I'm not exactly sure. We'll see. Now, I want to go over all of our characters really quick because I think what Agatha Christie has done in this novel so far, she's kind of painted a picture for us where any one of our characters can be the killer. Except, of course, Anthony Marston, who is dead, and Mrs. Rogers, who is dead. We, of course, talked about Philip and how Philip is a vicious and cruel guy. Murdered 21 men, could certainly be the killer. Justice Wargrave, we know, is both a liar and a murderer. General MacArthur is also a liar and a murderer. Vera Claythorne has sort of been our focus character so far. I'm not really sure if that makes her more suspicious or less, but there's clearly something shady in her past. I mean, look at this face. If that's not a guilty face, I don't know what is. How about Dr. Armstrong? He's also really creepy and really suspicious. This guy is having dreams about murdering some of the other guests in the house, and it is clear he has a drinking problem and drinks a lot. I would not be surprised if he was our killer in the least bit. Rogers is another guy who I would not be surprised. Maybe he killed his wife to make her quiet, just like Mr. Bloor thinks. Also, he's a suspicious butler. That automatically makes him sort of guilty. Mr. Bloor is another guy who lies and lies and lies. In the very beginning of this novel, he was not telling anybody his name. He is an untrustworthy person, and I feel like he could very much be our killer as well. And last but not least, we have Emily Brent, who is going around talking about punishments and sinners and this and that. So I think that pretty much covers everybody. And what I'm thinking about today is, who am I supposed to trust? Is there any character here that is trustworthy in the least bit? Is there any character here that I'm supposed to look towards and say, at least I know that this person didn't do it? Because as I looked at all of these half-smiling and smug faces, I think that any one of these people could be the murderer, and I would not be surprised in the least bit. That is what I love about this book, and that is what's making this book so interesting to me as we move forward. Now, for the rest of today's class, I want you to use Google Drive, and I want you to complete a little bit of a writing assignment for me. On Google Drive, you should create a new folder, and you should call that folder "and then they were none." Please be sure it goes in your English folder so that it's shared with me and I can see it. You should create a document in that folder, and I want you to call it "Letter Home." What I want you to do is I want you to assume the persona of one of our characters in our novel. It can be any character you want. Just, I would pick one of the characters that are still alive. I want you to write a first-person letter, so it should be from the I perspective, and it should be to somebody back home, sort of discussing what happened on the island so far. I want you to picture you writing a letter, folding it up, putting it in a glass box, a glass bottle, and throwing it out to sea in hopes that it gets back to your person. You can title it Dear Whoever. You can make up a character, but I just very simply want 3 strong paragraphs where you write a letter home discussing what your thoughts and feelings are now that Anthony Marston and Mrs. Rogers have died. That paragraph, those 3 paragraphs are homework. If you don't finish, please make sure you spend the rest of the class working on that. If you are done early, you can continue reading in this book, but please don't read any farther than chapter 7. Please have fun at field day tomorrow. Please prepare for the Poetry Slam. If this is something that you're doing, please make sure that you are following along with my video on Friday. I'll see you then.